Hi, my name is Andre Gonawella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. I'm delighted and honored to have Bishop Michael Curry on the podcast. He is the current presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, elected in 2015. He is the first African American elected to the role. He previously was the Bishop of North Carolina from 2000 to 2015, and his tenure as presiding bishop will actually end on October 2024, basically within a few days. You may remember him from his iconic and viral sermon at the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Duchess Meghan Markle. And this episode is sort of strange for me because it's a mixture of both my professional life and foreign policy, but also my religious life, because I've grown up Episcopalian all my life. So Bishop Curry is, well, my bishop. So Bishop Curry, thank you for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Andre, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you. It really is.
So this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk a lot about a lot of serious topics, but like a lot of topics that are, crucial to your heart, but also central to the Episcopal Church. So Bishop Curry, we often talk about the separation of church and state. There's a lot of toxicity and extremes when religion and politics gets mixed together. But, that doesn't necessarily preclude churches from advocacy. So, Bishop Curry, what is the role of the church in today's political sphere? And what grounds the Episcopal Church's political and policy advocacy?
Well, one of the differentiations that's important is that to be political and to be partisan are two different things. And churches are not allowed to, for example, endorse candidates or to do things that directly support a particular candidate, that kind of thing. And yet that doesn't prevent churches in this country from advocating for values that we hold and articulating those values and giving voice to them, and encouraging our people to live out those, to both name those values and to seek to live that out without telling them how they're supposed to do it. And so, for example, the Episcopal Church has an Office of Government Relations in Washington that advocates for public policies grounded in our moral teachings and social and moral teachings of the church as we understand them, usually voted on it by an official body, general convention, or an executive council, and then articulated by a presiding bishop or by the Office of Government Relations in their work with members of Congress and others in Washington. And so that's an appropriate role that's consistent with certainly separation of church and state and all of that. But we advocate for those things that we believe. And for example, we as Christians believe that the core of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth are to love God and to love our neighbor. The parable of the Good Samaritan, which was about one person of a different race and ethnicity and religious tradition who helped out a person in need who was a different ethnicity, religious tradition, and on and on and on, simply because he was a fellow child of God. You see what I mean? It didn't have to do with what your politics were, what your religion was, what your ethnicity was, or what your nationality, or what your political party is, or what all that. It has to do with the fact that this is a fellow human being created in the image of God, a fellow child of God, and therefore my brother, my sister, my sibling. And just because of that, that person helped the other person. That's what it means to be neighbor, Jesus said. And so we can, what does that look like in public policy? And so churches and maybe more importantly, individual Christians can seek to live that out in their lives with how they vote, how they participate in the public life and in public society, and by advocating for those things that do justice, that respect good, that respect the dignity of every human being, that help to make our society and our world a place where there's, as the old enslaved Africans used to say, where there's plenty good room for all God's children.
Of course. And, I think something that's very interesting for many folks who aren't familiar with the Episcopalian Church is the church's advocacy on LGBTQ plus issues, really setting it apart from other Christian denominations, particularly during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, and sort of since then in the decades. The Episcopal Church sits within the broader Anglican community, the Anglican community being, Church of England for, the folks who aren't familiar, which has not been as conciliatory, on some of these issues. So, for example, you have Uganda's anti-LGBTQ plus law, which includes death penalty provisions. That was praised by Uganda's Anglican Archbishop. How does the Episcopal Church how do you really, navigate this disparity of views, on key human rights issues within the broader Anglican community, when you're being sentenced to death and you're having, religious leaders endorse some of those policies?
Yeah, well, I can say this that in terms of human rights and human rights for everybody, including LGBTQ folk, the Anglican Communion has officially been consistent that human rights are to be respected, that there's not to be persecution or oppression of people because of their sexuality or their orientation. Um, so that the communion is officially on record, not just simply supportive, but saying we believe human rights are God-given. And even though there may be different perspectives about um, relationships, how people live that out, but the communion has been officially on record. Now, there are differences among individuals and even some of the individual churches about that, no question. But I think it's important to know that based on our understanding of how Jesus treated people, we've been clear and consistent that people are not to be mistreated because of who they are, and that they're not, that we are all created equal in the eyes of God. Now, how that gets lived out in different cultures, that's a different question. But the fundamental question of the rights of all humanity, created in the image of God, that's something where there is at least formal agreement by the church itself. But again, we allow freedom of expression, and so there are differences in different various churches. When I say churches, I'm talking about national church bodies. May have different perspectives and live them out, and that variety exists, just as it exists in here in the United States. That people have the right to have differing perspectives, even if we disagree with them.
Hmm. So I guess like how do you navigate some of those conversations, like when you're sort of meeting with the larger communion and so on? Uh like I'm just really curious about that piece, I guess.
Well, I mean, there are. I would say that the majority of the Anglican Communion, um, it's fair to say, hold a variety of perspectives, whether it's on human sexuality. Um, um, you're going to find a variety. Um, while we here in the U.S., probably Canada, Scotland, I mean, there are a number of countries, even in England, may have may be a minority in terms of LGBTQ issues. It's a growing minority and growing larger. Most of the communion are in parts of the world where LGBTQ questions are conservatively held. Let me say it that way. And that's the context in which folk live. Now, that doesn't mean that the majority of people are antagonistic to LGBTQ folk, that or that the average Anglican knows about all of those issues. And the Archbishop of Canterbury often says the average Anglican is an Anglican mother in her 30s with several children. That's the average Anglican. She's probably not paying attention to all of this. She's feeding her children. She's going to church. and she's feeding her children and caring for them. That's the average Anglican, is an African woman feeding her children. And so some of these questions are engaged on a different level than the place where the average Anglican actually lives. You see what I mean? She's not participating in positive or negative. She's not in the debate. She's trying to make sure her children eat. And in a lot of places where these women are, um, food insecurity is a real issue. It's life and death. Um, Climate change has affected a lot of this. And so she's thinking of other things. Um, so the Anglican Communion is a worldwide community. It's 85 million people all over the world, and mostly in the developing world in terms of majority of people. And my experience is there's a gracious hospitality. I've traveled on the continent of Africa, parts of Asia. There's just a graciousness. And a lot of times on the official level, we've agreed to disagree. And so I've always tried to be respectful. And I really believe that love is the key to everything, and the key to changed hearts eventually. And I've always tried to treat my brother and sister Anglicans with the kind of love and respect that I believe God wants us to have for every other human being created in the image of God.
So, Bishop Curry, not to move on to another hard topic, but the war in Gaza. So, this is a very emotional issue for a lot of people. Jerusalem, that whole area, is the center of three major religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. How do you navigate conversations on the war, as a church leader, given the significance of religion in this conflict? And, has anything surprised you about the nature of this ongoing war?
I don't know that it's surprised me, but it saddened me. I can say that for sure. I mean, I didn't see this coming in the way that it has, but I mean, I knew that this is a troubled land, and the world and the parties involved, we must help them find a way to live together in ways of justice and equity and peace. We must find that way. And that's because everybody, whether they are Palestinian or Israeli, everybody is a child of God. Christianity teaches that, Judaism teaches that, Islam teaches that. Everybody is a child of God. And we must find a way for all the children of God to live in equity, justice, and peace. Now, that's easier said than done, but if you don't have somewhere you're going, you'll never get there. So our nation and others like it must advocate and work for a cessation of hostilities, and for negotiated peace and for long-term resolutions that promote that kind of equity and justice and peace. And so, holding fast to that moral principle, it seems to me that's what we as Christians, but I believe people of goodwill of all religions can stand for. That's where there may be common ground, and working out the details of two-state solution or others. I mean, I happen to think the two-state solution is the longer-term solution in terms of practical solution. And you got to figure out how that can work out. That's clearly not something that's going to happen tomorrow. But in the long run, it seems to me is the path that has the best possibility of two peoples being able to live together in peace, in their own nations, with liberty, justice for all, and security, and everything that's needed for human society. Um, the fighting must end. It's not sustainable. The fighting must end. Um, and children are supposed to be in school, not fleeing for their lives. You know, um, it doesn't matter whether you're Palestinian or Israeli, you're a child of God, and nobody is meant to be killed by anybody else. God didn't make us for that. Now, the hard work of getting to those solutions is the work that is before us. And our leaders here in this country, as well as other nations, and the leaders of the respective parties that are involved, um, and the leadership of Arab nations that are trying to find solutions. All of us together have to keep working at it until that hopeful possibility comes into being. The one thing we can't do is we can't give up.
So, Bishop Curry, one thing that I've heard from sermons when I go to the National Cathedral every so often here in DC, and something you've been outspoken about, is this idea of Christian nationalism. A lot of people will think of that concept in terms of the mixture of religion and politics in the United States specifically. Bishop Curry, what is Christian nationalism and how do you view it?
Well, the notion of Christian nationalism is that, let me phrase it this way. It is a an attempt to fuse Christianity itself and our national life into one, saying that we are a Christian nation and that being a Christian nation grants us certain levels of superiority to other nations and to other peoples. That Jesus never talked about anything like that. It's that is the notion of Christian nationalism is a false creation. It is not something that Jesus of Nazareth ever talked about. It is not something that he ever advocated. And it is not the way that we follow Jesus as Christians. That I believe that firmly and clearly. Um, and so as a result, I am a Christian who is a citizen. But I know Jewish folk who are Jewish and are citizens. I know Muslims who are Muslim and citizens. Um, I know secular folk who are secular and citizens. The point is, being an American is not about being any religious tradition. It is about being a country where there is room for all religious traditions. See what I mean? And to talk about Christian nationalism is to suggest that America, that the United States, is one particular religious tradition, in this case, Christianity, on the way it's being used. And that is a false notion. That is not what America is about. America is to make room for all of religious faiths, all convictions, so long as they're nonviolent and peaceful, of course, but to make room for all of that. And where there is freedom of religious expression for all. And no one can claim that any religious tradition dominates any other. And when we get into that territory where any religious tradition does dominate, we are in trouble and violating the very roots of this country where there is meant to be religious liberty. I think of the state of Rhode Island and Roger Williams and the principle of religious freedom. That is a deep, abiding principle in the American experiment. And to let that go is dangerous. It is dangerous to this society and dangerous when we begin to think of ourselves as better than anybody else. This is a wonderful country. I love this country. I am a loyal American, a loyal citizen, but I'm a citizen of the kingdom of heaven first. You see, but I don't proclaim that somebody else has to be exactly the same as I am in order to be a loyal American and a loyal. You see what I'm saying? There's, as the old slaves used to say, they used to sing a song, there's plenty good room, plenty good room, plenty good room for all God's children. And America at its best is a place where there's plenty good room for all of God's children, for a great variety, diversity, and tapestry that makes America America.
So, Bishop Curry, what does the term evangelism mean to you and the Episcopal Church in today's context? When my non-Christian friends, many of which I have, think of the term evangelism or evangelical, they'll often think of people chasing them down with pamphlets, asking them, like, do you believe? You need to believe, like come over to this or that, and they get a very negative view as a result, of that term. So, what does it mean to you and the Episcopal Church?
Evangelism at its best has nothing to do with religious domination. It is nothing to do with Christian imperialism, subduing other religious faiths. Jesus had nothing to do with that. There's not one shred of evidence that Jesus had anything to do with that kind of stuff. That's imperialism. That's human arrogance. That is not evangelism. Evangelism has to do with my bearing witness to the faith that is in me as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth and his way of unconditional love. That's what evangelism is. And to bear witness to that and to share that way of love, that's evangelism. Now, does that mean everybody becomes Christian? No. Does that mean that some do? Yes. Does that mean I consider Christians superior and everybody else inferior? No. Does that mean we're all God's children? Yes. And it's about my being willing to both share and witness to the way of Jesus of Nazareth and his way of love. And that way of love is not imperialistic. It is not domineering. It is not coercive. It does not demand that you must be like me in order to be loved by God. You see, and again, it's not about any of that stuff. It's about, you know what? This Jesus had something to say to us. He's shown us a way of living that really does live out the love that is born of the God who the Bible says is love. And some folk may want to join us on that journey. And if they do, come on. And other folk may find other ways to follow their leading of how they hear God speaking to them. So be it. There's plenty good room for all God's children. That is what I call a gracious evangelism, not a domineering one, not an arrogant one, but someone that looks something like Jesus of Nazareth and his way of love.
Bishop Curry, on that note, thank you so much for joining me here on the Burn Bag podcast. I really appreciate it. Congratulations on a very amazing and successful tenure as Bishop of the Episcopal Church. You are my bishop, of course.
Oh, you're awesome.
I really appreciate this so much. And, thank you for, taking the time in these last few days to, join me here on this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, brother, and God bless you.
Thank you.